Imagine this for a moment. A battlefield surrounded, guns ready, silence hanging in the air. An American officer delivers a surrender demand, and the German major looks him in the eye and says, "You'll have to kill me." What happens next is not what movies tell you. No dramatic speech, no negotiation, just one decision by General George S. Patton that sealed the fate of every man standing there. Tonight, you're not going to hear a legend. You're going to hear the truth about honor, pride, and the brutal cost of refusing to surrender in Patton's war. We'll explain everything in this video, step by step. Don't skip it. The winter air in Germany carried the smell of cordite, frozen earth, and exhaustion. By early 1945, the war was no longer a clash of ideologies. It was a test of endurance, will, and pride. Entire cities lay in ruins. Armies moved not with hope but with momentum. And standing at the edge of this collapsing world was General George S. Patton, blunt, profane, relentless, and feared by both enemies and his own men. Patton did not believe in half measures. He believed wars were won by speed, aggression, and psychological dominance. To Patton, hesitation was death, and surrender, when offered honestly, was mercy. But on this day, mercy would be challenged. A German defensive position, isolated, surrounded, and hopelessly outgunned, still resisted American advances. Intelligence confirmed the unit was commanded by a German major, a professional officer of the old Prussian school. His men were low on ammunition. Supplies were nearly gone. Escape was impossible. The Americans sent forward the universal language of war's end, a surrender demand. It was delivered clearly, formally, without insult. The response came back just as clearly. "I will not surrender. You will have to kill me." It was not shouted. It was not theatrical. It was calm, defiant, final. When the message reached Patton, there was no visible anger, only a narrowing of the eyes. He had heard words like this before, from men clinging not to victory but to identity, officers raised on duty, honor, and obedience long after reason had abandoned the battlefield. Patton understood this mindset better than most. He respected courage, even in enemies, but he despised wasted lives. He did not argue. He did not send another negotiator. He ordered the attack. Artillery was positioned with brutal efficiency. Guns that had thundered across North Africa, Sicily, and France now turned toward a position already condemned by history. Patton was not making an example. He was fulfilling the German major's own declaration. The bombardment began without ceremony. Shells tore through earthworks and shattered concrete. Defensive guns were silenced one by one. Communications collapsed. Smoke swallowed the position whole. Inside, the German major stood among men who now understood the meaning of his words. This was not a duel of generals. This was the cost of refusal. American infantry advanced through the smoke, trained, methodical, relentless. They found what Patton already knew they would find: dead and wounded men who had followed an order that could not save them. The German major was found among them. He had not fled, he had not surrendered, he had kept his word. When Patton was informed, he did not celebrate, he did not boast, he did not smile. Instead, he reportedly said words that revealed the core of his brutal clarity. His courage was real, his decision was stupid. To Patton, war was not a place for romantic gestures. It was not a stage for last stands meant to impress history. War was arithmetic. Men, time, firepower, and every unnecessary death was a failure of leadership. The German major had chosen pride over survival. Patton chose to end the fight quickly. This moment exposes something uncomfortable about war. Honor does not stop artillery. Courage does not cancel strategy, and refusal, no matter how brave, does not change reality. Yet there is tragedy here, not villainy. The German major was not a monster. He was a soldier shaped by decades of doctrine that taught surrender was dishonor, obedience was sacred, and death was preferable to defeat. He stood in a war already lost, defending ground that no longer mattered, for a regime that had already betrayed its men. Patton understood that too. He had no illusions about heroism. He knew that history remembers victories, but cemeteries remember decisions. That is why Patton pushed so hard, moved so fast, and struck so brutally, not because he loved killing, but because he believed prolonged war was the greatest crime of all. In the end, this encounter was not about Patton versus a German major. It was about two worldviews colliding in the final months of a collapsing empire. One man believed honor demanded death. The other believed leadership demanded results. Both were soldiers. Only one had the power to decide how many would die. And when faced with defiance, Patton did exactly what war had trained him to do. He finished it, not with hatred, not with revenge, but with the cold, merciless logic of a general who knew that every minute of resistance meant more graves on both sides. This is the truth of war history, not glory, not speeches, but decisions made in silence, where pride meets steel and only one survives. The message was written plainly, without flourish or insult, carried forward under a white flag that meant the same thing in every language of war. It stated the facts as they were. The German position was surrounded, cut off from reinforcements, outnumbered, and facing overwhelming firepower. Further resistance would lead only to destruction. Surrender was offered not as humiliation, but as survival. The American officer delivering it had done this before many times, and he had learned to read the faces of men who already knew the truth but were not yet ready to accept it. This time the answer came back quickly, almost calmly, as if the German major had been waiting for the question. He did not negotiate. He did not ask for time. He did not attempt to save face with conditions. His reply was short, precise, and absolute. "I will not surrender. You'll have to kill me." Those words carried more than defiance. They carried an entire military culture compressed into a single sentence. The German major was not speaking only for himself. He was speaking for generations of officers trained to believe that surrender was a moral failure, that an officer's duty was to stand until the end, regardless of odds or outcome. He was speaking for a system that had taught obedience as virtue and sacrifice as proof of worth. In that moment, surrounded by the wreckage of a collapsing Reich, the war narrowed down to a personal decision shaped by years of doctrine and pride. He understood the tactical situation perfectly. He knew there would be no relief. He knew the Americans were telling the truth. But surrender to him was a line that could not be crossed without destroying the very identity he had built his life around. When the reply reached American command, it was read aloud without embellishment. There was no confusion about its meaning. This was not a bluff, not a stalling tactic, not a miscommunication. It was a refusal in its purest form. For Patton, such moments stripped war of all abstraction. There were no maps or arrows here, no speeches about destiny or democracy. There was only a man making a choice that would determine the fate of everyone under his command. Patton had seen this before in North Africa, in Sicily, in France. He had watched enemy officers cling to doomed positions long after logic demanded withdrawal or surrender. He had also seen the cost of indulging such defiance, delays, casualties, and prolonged fighting that achieved nothing except more death. Patton did not take the refusal personally. He did not view it as an insult. To him, it was simply information. The enemy had stated, high, as intent clearly, there would be no surrender. That clarity removed all uncertainty. In Patton's mind, uncertainty was the most dangerous element in war. Once it was gone, the path forward became brutally simple. He understood that every additional minute spent negotiating with a man who had already decided to die was a minute stolen from momentum. and momentum in Patton's worldview was everything. The faster the war moved, the sooner it would end. The sooner it ended, the fewer men would be buried. The German major, inside his defensive perimeter, likely felt a strange calm after sending the message. The decision had been made. The burden of choice was lifted. There would be no retreat, no surrender paperwork, no explanations to give his men beyond the silent understanding that this was how it would end. Around him were soldiers who trusted him, men who had followed orders through years of chaos and retreat, through bombed cities and broken roads. Some of them may have hoped for surrender, may have imagined captivity as a chance to live. Others may have shared his resolve, seeing death as preferable to capture. None of them could undo the words he had sent. The sentence had sealed their fate as surely as any artillery barrage. For the Americans, the refusal meant something equally final. There would be no prisoners taken from that position, not because they would not accept them, but because none would be offered. The surrender demand had been the last bridge. Once burned, the only remaining language was violence. Patton's army was built for that language. Guns were already in place. Infantry units were prepared. This was not an emotional reaction. It was procedure. War reduced to its most mechanical form. A position refuses to surrender. Firepower is applied until resistance ends. Yet even within that machinery, there was an undercurrent of unease. American soldiers were not automatons. They understood what refusal meant. They knew they were about to advance against men who had decided not to live. Such fights were always the bloodiest. A cornered enemy did not retreat. He did not break easily. He fought until silence replaced command. The surrender refusal transformed the coming battle into something darker, stripping away the hope that at some point hands would go up and shooting would stop. The German major's words echoed beyond the tactical situation. They were a reminder that wars are fought not just by strategies and weapons, but by beliefs. His belief told him that surrender was worse than death. Patton's belief told him that prolonging a lost fight was an unforgivable waste. Neither man saw himself as cruel. Both believed they were acting correctly. And between those beliefs lay the ground where men would fall. As preparations continued, the refusal took on a symbolic weight. It represented the last stubborn resistance of an army that had once seemed unstoppable, now reduced to isolated pockets of defiance. It showed how ideology and training could outlive reason, compelling men to fight for ground that had no future. The words, "You'll have to kill me," were not a challenge meant to provoke. They were an acceptance of what the war had become, an acknowledgement that there was no path left except through destruction. In that frozen moment between refusal and response, the war revealed one of its harshest truths, that clarity can be more lethal than confusion. The German major had been clear. Patton would be just as clear in return. And once clarity replaced hesitation, the machinery of war moved forward with unstoppable force, carrying with it the consequences of a single sentence spoken by a man who believed that surrender was a fate worse than death, standing among soldiers whose lives were now bound to that belief, waiting for the inevitable thunder that would answer words with steel and fire, turning conviction into casualties and transforming defiance into silence. For Patton, war was never a slow argument between opposing ideas. It was a violent equation that had to be solved as quickly as possible. Speed was not merely a tactic to him, it was a moral principle. Every day the war continued meant more bodies, more letters sent home, more young men lost to mud, steel, and fear. He believed that hesitation killed more soldiers than aggression ever could, and that the fastest way to save lives was to end the fighting before it could drag on and harden into something even more destructive. This belief shaped everything he did, from the way he spoke to his men to the way he responded when an enemy refused to surrender. Patton's approach to war had been forged long before Europe burned. He studied history obsessively, not for romance, but for patterns. He saw how decisive commanders broke enemy will by moving faster than expected, striking harder than anticipated, and refusing to give opponents time to recover. To Patton, speed created shock, and shock created collapse. When armies collapsed, wars ended. When wars ended, soldiers went home alive. This logic, cold as it sounded, was rooted in a deeply personal fear of waste. Patton could accept death in battle. What he could not accept was death without purpose, men killed because their leaders hesitated or sought comfort in caution. Force in Patton's mind was not cruelty, it was clarity. A powerful, overwhelming strike removed ambiguity from the battlefield. It told the enemy that resistance was futile and that survival lay only in surrender. Half measures, on the other hand, encouraged defiance. They invited the enemy to believe he might endure, might hold on, might somehow turn the tide. Patton despised that kind of thinking because it extended suffering. When confronted with resistance, his instinct was always to apply enough force to break it decisively, not to test it or probe it slowly. He believed that the enemy, once crushed quickly, would lose both the means and the will to continue. This philosophy explains why Patton reacted the way he did when faced with a refusal to surrender. To him, the refusal was not an emotional affront. It was a signal that psychological dominance had not yet been achieved. The enemy still believed in the possibility of meaningful resistance, however irrational that belief might have been. Patton's response was to erase that belief through action. He had no patience for drawn-out negotiations or symbolic gestures. Once surrender was rejected, the purpose of force shifted from persuasion to termination of resistance. The goal was no longer to convince, but to conclude. Patton's emphasis on speed also reflected his understanding of modern warfare. He knew that industrialized war magnified delay. Artillery, air power, mechanized infantry, these tools made prolonged fighting exponentially more lethal. A slow advance meant more opportunities for ambush, more time for the enemy to reorganize, more chances for mistakes. A rapid advance, by contrast, overwhelmed command structures and denied the enemy time to adapt. Patton wanted to move so fast that the opponent was constantly reacting, never thinking, always off balance. In such conditions, resistance often collapsed before it could fully form. There was also a psychological dimension to Patton's philosophy that went beyond tactics. He believed that fear was contagious, and so was confidence. By acting decisively and aggressively, he aimed to project inevitability. His troops were meant to feel that victory was not just likely, but unavoidable. The enemy, in turn, was meant to feel that defeat had already arrived, even if the shooting had not yet stopped. Speed amplified this effect. A fast-moving army appeared larger, stronger, and more dangerous than it actually was. It created the impression of an unstoppable force, rolling forward without pause. When Patton ordered attacks after a surrender refusal, he was applying this psychological logic. He understood that any delay might embolden other enemy units to resist. Word traveled quickly on the battlefield. If one German position refused to surrender and survive for days, others might follow the example. Patton wanted the opposite lesson to spread. He wanted refusal to be seen as futile, even suicidal. Not out of vengeance, but out of calculation. If resistance collapsed faster elsewhere, fewer battles would have to be fought at all. Ending resistance quickly was, to Patton, the highest form of mercy war could offer. This belief put him at odds with those who saw restraint as inherently humane. Patton argued the opposite. He believed that restraint, in the face of determined resistance, only prolonged the agony. A war that lingered on through cautious advances and limited engagements, would consume far more lives than one concluded through decisive action. His critics saw brutality, he saw efficiency, his supporters saw results. History saw both. Patton was also acutely aware of the burden of command. Every decision he made sent me and forward into danger. He carried that weight constantly, even if he masked it behind bluster and profanity. Speed allowed him to feel that he was not wasting the sacrifices of his soldiers. If men were going to die, he wanted their deaths to contribute directly to ending the war, not to maintaining a stalemate. This sense of responsibility drove his impatience with anything that threatened to slow the advance, including enemy defiance that had no realistic chance of success. The refusal to surrender, therefore, triggered not anger but resolve. It confirmed Patton's belief that some opponents could only be dealt with through force. Negotiation required a shared understanding of reality, and when that understanding no longer existed, negotiation became meaningless. In such cases, the only language left was overwhelming violence applied with precision and speed. Patton did not relish this, but he accepted it as an unavoidable truth of war. Underlying all of this was Patton's obsession with ending the war itself. He did not fight for territory for its own sake. He fought to collapse the enemy's ability to continue. Every destroyed position, every broken unit brought that end closer. When he ordered swift, forceful attacks, he was always looking beyond the immediate battle to the cumulative effect on the enemy's will and capacity. Speed was the accelerator of that process, and force was the fuel. Patton's philosophy left little room for romantic notions of honorable last stand. Yes, he had no patience for gestures meant to impress history at the cost of living men. To him, honor lay in accomplishing the mission as efficiently as possible, not in dying dramatically. When confronted by officers who chose death over surrender, he saw not heroes, but failures of leadership who had confused pride with duty. In this way, Patton's actions were consistent, almost inevitable. Given his beliefs, there was no alternative path. A refusal to surrender demanded a response that would not only eliminate that specific resistance, but also reinforce the larger momentum of the campaign. Speed ensured that the response would come before doubt or sympathy could interfere. Force ensured that the response would be final, and the rapid ending of resistance ensured that the war in its entirety moved one step closer to being over, driven forward by a commander who believed that the quickest road through hell was the straightest one, marked by relentless motion, decisive blows, and the unshakable conviction that ending the fight mattered more than how gently it was fought. The refusal to surrender exposed a deeper conflict than the one marked on maps and orders. It was not simply Americans against Germans or victors against the defeated. It was a collision between two ideas of what it meant to be an officer, to hold authority, to act honorably when the structure supporting that authority was already collapsing. On one side stood a tradition that measured honor by obedience and endurance, even when endurance served no strategic purpose. On the other stood a view that judged leadership by outcomes, by the ability to recognize when further resistance only multiplied loss without changing fate. The German major had been shaped by an institution that prized steadfastness above all else. From his earliest training, he would have been taught that an officer's duty was to stand firm, to hold his position, to embody the will of the state in the army regardless of circumstance. Surrender was framed not as a tactical option, but as a moral failure, a betrayal of comrades and command. Even as the war turned against Germany, even as entire armies were destroyed or captured, that lesson did not disappear. If anything, it hardened. The worse the situation became, the more intensely some officers clung to the idea that death was preferable to yielding. Strategic reality, however, had moved on without them. By the final months of the war, Germany's ability to influence the outcome had effectively vanished. Industrial capacity was shattered, air superiority was gone, supply lines were broken, units fought in isolation, cut off from meaningful coordination. In this environment, the traditional language of honor no longer aligned with any achievable military goal. Holding a position did not protect a larger front. Dying in place did not buy time for a counteroffensive that no longer existed. Yet for officers like the German major, acknowledging this meant more tea than admitting defeat. It meant admitting that the values they had lived by no longer made sense. This is where the clash became unavoidable. The American command, and Patton in particular, operated under a different logic. They were not immune to ideas of honor or courage, but those ideas were subordinate to strategy. Honor was not found in the refusal to adapt, but in the responsibility to make decisions that preserved lives when possible and achieved objectives efficiently. From this perspective, surrender in a hopeless situation was not shameful. It was rational. It allowed soldiers to live, to be removed from a fight already decided, and it allowed the war to move closer to its conclusion. When the German major refused to surrender, he was asserting a moral framework that no longer matched the reality of the battlefield. His sense of honor demanded resistance even when resistance had become meaningless. Patton's sense of leadership demanded the opposite. He saw that clinging to symbolic defiance only prolonged suffering. To him, the honorable act was to end the fight decisively, not to indulge a doomed stand out of respect for tradition. This divergence reveals how war strips away shared assumptions. Earlier in the conflict, both sides might have understood honor in similar terms: courage under fire, loyalty to comrades, competence in command. By the end, those commonalities had eroded. The German officer's honor was inward-facing, concerned with personal and institutional identity. Patton's was outward-facing, concerned with consequences and results. One looked backward to inherited ideals, the other looked forward to ending the war as quickly as possible. The tragedy lies in the fact that both perspectives were internally coherent. The German major was not acting irrationally within his own belief system. He was fulfilling what he had been taught was expected of him. His refusal was an attempt to preserve meaning in a situation where meaning was dissolving. If he surrendered, he would live, but he might also feel that he had invalidated his entire career, that he had become something he no longer recognized. Death, in that framework, offered a grim consistency. Patton, however, could not allow individual belief systems to dictate the pace of a global war. He was responsible not only for his own men, but for the broader campaign. Allowing one officer's concept of honor to delay operations or encourage further resistance would have consequences far beyond that single position. Strategic reality demanded that resistance be eliminated quickly, not debated or admired. In Patton's calculus, respecting the enemy's courage did not require accommodating his refusal. This is where leadership becomes a burden rather than a privilege. The ability to decide for others, especially when those decisions lead to death, forces a choice between empathy and obligation. Patton understood the human impulse behind the refusal. He recognized courage when he saw it, even in enemies. But recognition did not change the fact that the stand served no strategic purpose. To act otherwise would have been to prioritize sentiment over responsibility. The clash between honor and strategy also highlights how war redefines virtue. In peacetime, steadfastness and refusal to compromise are often praised. In war, especially a war already decided, those same qualities can become destructive. What once symbolized strength becomes rigidity. What once inspired loyalty becomes a trap. The German major's honor bound his men to a fate they might not have chosen for themselves, all in service of an ideal that could not alter the outcome. Patton's approach, by contrast, treated honor as inseparable from judgment. Knowing when to fight and when to stop fighting was, to him, the true mark of a commander. A leader who could not recognize defeat condemned his men to die for appearances. From this perspective, the refusal to surrender was not heroic but negligent, a failure to adapt to reality. Yet the battlefield offered no space to resolve this philosophical conflict gently. There was no neutral ground where honor and strategy could be reconciled. The refusal forced an immediate decision, and that decision would be enforced with violence. In that sense, war itself became the arbiter, translating abstract values into physical outcomes. The German major's honor would be measured in casualties. Patton's strategy would be measured in how quickly resistance ended. The moment encapsulated the end of an era. Old codes of military honor, shaped by earlier conflicts and different technologies, collided with a form of warfare that left little room for symbolic gestures. Industrialized combat demanded efficiency above all else. Those who could not adjust were crushed by its momentum. In this clash, there was no clear moral victory, only an illustration of how incompatible frameworks produce irreversible consequences. The German major held fast to an honor that required his death. Patton held fast to a strategy that required the elimination of resistance. Both acted according to their convictions. The battlefield would not judge which conviction was nobler, only which one prevailed. As the shells fell and the smoke closed in around men whose lives were being decided by ideals that could not coexist, frozen in a moment where tradition met inevitability and neither could step aside. The moment a refusal was given, the cost shifted from hypothetical to inevitable. Until then, survival had remained an option, however slim, hovering in the space between words and actions. Once the German major chose defiance, that space collapsed. His decision did not exist in isolation. It wrapped itself around every soldier under his command, binding their lives to a single act of loyalty and pride. Many of those men had not spoken the words, "You'll have to kill me," yet they would pay the price for them all the same. In war, refusal is never purely personal. An officer's authority carries weight precisely because it overrides individual will. The German major's men were trained to obey, conditioned to trust that their commander saw something they did not, that endurance might still serve a purpose. Some may have believed in that purpose, others may have doubted silently, sensing that the war had already moved past them, that surrender might mean captivity but also survival. None of that mattered once the decision was made. The structure of command transformed one man's conviction into collective fate. As artillery preparations began, the abstract idea of honor became painfully concrete. Trenches that had once offered protection became traps. Buildings that had provided shelter became targets. Ammunition that had once represented security dwindled with every exchange. The fatal cost of refusal unfolded not in a single moment, but in a sequence of escalating consequences. Each shell that landed confirmed what logic had already predicted. Each casualty reduced the unit's ability to resist. Yet resistance continued because stopping would mean acknowledging that the sacrifice had been for nothing. The men inside that position faced a narrowing set of choices, none of them good. To fight on was to accept almost certain death. To surrender without orders was to violate everything they had been taught, risking punishment, shame, or worse in the culture that had shaped them. Fear operated on multiple levels. Fear of dying under bombardment. Fear of being labeled a coward. Fear of betraying comrades by acting alone. The refusal locked them into this dilemma, forcing them to endure until the end or until chaos replaced command. From the American side, the cost manifested differently, but no less brutally. An enemy that refused to surrender demanded full application of force. Infantry had to advance against defenders who knew they would not survive and therefore had nothing to lose. Such opponents were unpredictable and dangerous. Every room had to be cleared. Every trench had to be taken under fire. Casualties mounted not because the position was strategically important, but because it had been made symbolically absolute by refusal. Men died on both sides for ground that would be abandoned as soon as resistance ended. This is the hidden cruelty of defiance in a lost cause. It creates death without delay and without gain. The German major's refusal did not change the outcome of the war, did not slow the Allied advance in any meaningful way, did not protect civilians or buy time for negotiation. What it did was ensure that the end came violently rather than quietly. It guaranteed that men who might have lived would instead be buried or maimed, their futures erased in service of an idea that could not alter reality. For the soldiers involved, the fatal cost was not only physical. Survivors on both sides would carry the memory of that refusal long after the guns moved on. American soldiers would remember our faces in the smoke, the knowledge that these men had been given a chance to live, and that the chance had been refused. German soldiers, if any survived, would remember comrades lost not in a desperate bid to save something, but in a stand that history would barely note. The weight of those memories would linger, shaping how they understood obedience, honor, and leadership. The refusal also stripped away illusions about control. Once the attack began, the German major could no longer manage events. His authority diminished with every explosion that severed communications and shattered formations. The choice he had made with clarity became chaos in execution. Men fought not because they believed victory was possible, but because stopping felt impossible. In that sense, the refusal enslaved those it was meant to dignify, turning autonomy into compulsion. This pattern repeated itself across the collapsing fronts of the war. Isolated units held on long after strategic coherence had vanished, their resistance driven less by hope than by inertia and fear of dishonor. Each refusal added to the cumulative human cost, stretching the war's final phase into a series of unnecessary bloodbaths. The fatal cost was measured not in territory lost or gained, but in lives extinguished after the outcome was already certain. Patton understood this pattern intimately. He had seen how stubborn resistance multiplied casualties without changing results. To him, every refusal represented a fail. Year of leadership on the enemy side, a decision that placed ideology above responsibility. The tragedy was that the soldiers who suffered most from that failure were often the least invested in it. They were men who followed orders because that was what soldiers did, even when those orders led only to death. The German major's stand illustrates how loyalty can become lethal when detached from reality. Loyalty to superiors, to tradition, to an abstract notion of honor can override the basic instinct to survive. When that happens, leadership transforms from guidance into coercion. The fatal cost of refusal is paid by those who have no voice in the decision, whose lives are treated as proof rather than as irreplaceable human beings. As the fighting reached its climax, the refusal achieved its only tangible result, destruction. Positions were overrun, weapons were silenced, bodies lay where they had fallen, uniforms torn, insignia meaningless in the face of death. The battlefield bore no sign of the ideals that had justified the stand, only the evidence of force applied to end it. The ground did not remember honor or defiance. It absorbed blood and shell fragments without distinction. In the aftermath, the refusal offered no comfort to the dead. It did not elevate them beyond their suffering or grant their loss a higher purpose. They became part of the war's vast whole, one more cluster of names that blurred into statistics. The fatal cost, once paid, could not be reclaimed or reframed. It existed only as absence, as families who would never see their sons return, as futures that ended in a moment decided by someone else. This is the harsh truth revealed by that stand. Refusal, when detached from any achievable goal, becomes a sentence passed on others. It transforms conviction into obligation and pride into a weapon turned inward. The cost is not borne by the idea itself, which survives unscathed, but by flesh and blood caught beneath it. In the end, the refusal achieved nothing except to prove that men can be compelled to die for principles that no longer protect them. That the final currency of defiance in a lost war is paid entirely in lives, counted in silence after the guns move on and the world advances without them. Patton's reaction after the fighting ended revealed more about him than the thunder of guns ever could. When reports came in describing the fate of the German major and his men, there was no triumph in his response, no sense of personal victory. He did not mock the refusal or dismiss the courage behind it. Instead, his judgment cut in a different direction, separating bravery from wisdom with the precision of a commander who had spent a lifetime watching men die because of poor decisions. He recognized the courage required to stand firm in the face of overwhelming force, but he refused to confuse that courage with good leadership. To Patton, courage was common on the battlefield. He saw it daily in his own soldiers, men who had advanced under fire, crossed open ground knowing they might not survive and continued forward anyway. Courage alone, therefore, was not enough to justify command decisions. Leadership, in his view, demanded something harsher and rarer, the ability to accept reality and act accordingly, even when that action wounded pride or violated tradition. The German major had been brave. Patton conceded that without hesitation. What he had not been, in Patton's eyes, was responsible. This distinction mattered deeply to Patton because he believed that officers existed to serve their men, not the other way around. Rank was not a license to sacrifice lives for symbolism. It was an obligation to preserve combat power and human life whenever possible while still accomplishing the mission. When surrender could save lives without altering the strategic outcome, refusing it became an act of vanity disguised as honor. Patton saw this as the ultimate failure of command, valuing personal or institutional pride over the lives entrusted to you. Patton's judgment was not rooted in cruelty toward the enemy. In fact, it reflected a grim empathy. He understood why the German major had refused. He understood the training, the indoctrination, the pressure of history bearing down on an officer raised to believe that surrender erased his worth. But understanding did not equal approval. Patton believed that the measure of a leader was not how well he embodied an ideal, but how effectively he navigated reality. Ideals that demanded unnecessary death were, to Patton, bankrupt. This perspective was shaped by Patton's own relationship with risk and responsibility. He exposed himself to danger constantly, often appearing at the front lines where he could be killed as easily as any private. Critics accused him of recklessness, but Patton saw a difference between risking oneself and sacrificing others. He was willing to die for his decisions. He was far less willing to let his men die for gestures that changed nothing. That is why the German major's refusal struck him as fundamentally wrong. It asked subordinates to pay the price for a stand that benefited no one. In Patton's mind, leadership was inseparable from accountability. A commander who ordered men to fight on in a hopeless situation should be able to explain what that sacrifice would achieve. If the answer was nothing beyond preserving personal honor, then the order was indefensible. Patton judged leadership by results because results were the only things that could if he lost. Territory gained, enemy capability destroyed, war shortened. These were outcomes that could give meaning, however tragic, to death. The German major's decision produced none of these. Patton also understood the broader implications of such refusals. Each unnecessary stand hardened the war's ending, turning what could have been mass surrenders into bloody clearances. That meant more American casualties as well, more families on his side receiving telegrams that could have been avoided. From Patton's perspective, poor leadership on the enemy's side inflicted harm beyond its own ranks. It dragged others into death through stubbornness. This amplified his condemnation not as a personal insult, but as a professional assessment. When Patton labeled the decision stupid, he was not dismissing courage, he was condemning its misuse. To him, courage without judgment was dangerous. It created martyrs instead of victories and graves instead of peace. A leader who could not distinguish between when to fight and when to stop fighting had failed at the most basic level of command. That failure, Patton believed, was more serious than cowardice because it destroyed lives while pretending to be noble. This harsh clarity extended to how Patton viewed his own legacy. He did not want to be remembered for dramatic stands or eloquent last words. He wanted to be remembered as a commander who finished the job. Ending the war mattered more to him than how clean or gentle the process appeared. In that context, his judgment of the German major was also a warning to his own officers. Courage would be expected, sacrifice would be demanded, but pointless sacrifice would not be tolerated. Patton's conclusion stripped war of comforting illusions. It challenged the idea that dying bravely automatically conferred honor. Instead, it placed responsibility at the center of leadership. Who benefits from this decision? Who pays for it? Does it bring the end closer or push it further away? These were the questions Patton believed commanders had to answer honestly, without hiding behind tradition or rhetoric. The German major's fate became, in Patton's mind, an example of what happened when those questions were ignored. The courage was undeniable. The outcome was catastrophic. Men died who did not have to die. The war moved on regardless. Nothing was saved by the stand, no line held, no future altered. All that remained was the silence after the guns stopped, and the knowledge that a different choice could have led to life instead of death. Patton did not deny the humanity of the enemy. He denied the sanctity of bad decisions. His judgment was not emotional, it was surgical. He separated bravery from wisdom, honor from responsibility, and found the refusal wanting. In doing so, he articulated one of the most uncomfortable truths of war, that the moral weight of leadership lies not in how willing one is to die, but in how willing one is to live with the burden of choosing life for others when pride demands the opposite. Thank you for listening, and don't forget to like and subscribe.